Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Bora, and I'm the Executive Director and Legal Counsel for the Vermont Human Rights Commission. If you're here today and you're new to fair housing, I want to actually plug the HRC's fair housing training that we put on virtually every second Monday of the month. And it's a 2-hour training. It's free. You just have to sign up. We review the rights and duties under Vermont's fair housing laws. Both tenants and landlords are welcomed. And if those dates don't work for you, we're happy to also schedule a fair housing training for your group at a more convenient time. I am a firm believer in the sentiment that, like, if you don't know what your rights are, then you don't have any. Education and outreach is an important part of what we do at the Human Rights Commission, and it's also part of our statutory duty, and we do take it very seriously, which is why we've put on this civil rights training and conference. I am really excited today to share this virtual stage with two friends and colleagues, Jessica Hyman, Director of the Fair Housing Project at Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. That is a mouthful. And Rachel Batterson, Director of the Fair Housing Project at Vermont Legal Aid. And I'm going to turn it to them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their organizations and the work that they do, and to maybe share personal connections to this work. Rachel, would you like to kick us off first?
Sure. Hi, Rachel Batterson. I work at Legal Aid, and I manage our housing discrimination work, or fair housing work. And what that means is we investigate claims of discrimination in housing. We file cases and represent people in those cases. We advocate with policymakers, including municipalities, around land use and affordable housing development, actually. I think this panel we're going to be pivoting a little bit because we talked a lot about affordable housing last time, and this is more about housing discrimination, and kind of those two things go together. And I'll just say I'm a white, cis, hetero woman, so I've never been discriminated against because I'm a person of color, clearly. I'm also a lifelong renter until 3 years ago. As a kid, I was discriminated against because, well, my family was, because we had kids. My parents moved us constantly. I lived in 22 homes in 21 years. I was evicted twice. On the other hand, I was also a really highly privileged person because I lived as a white person in both South Africa and Namibia. So I think because of all that moving, housing is like so important to me. I can get really emotional about it. And there are policy reasons for that, but I think it's also very personal. In my spare time, my favorite things are landscape architecture, design, and interior decorating. So yeah, it's all about housing for me.
Hi, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Bora, and the whole Human Rights Commission team for putting on this amazing conference. So I'm Jess Hyman with the Fair Housing Project of CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. And the Fair Housing Project is part of our statewide housing advocacy programs, which also include Vermont Tenants, mobile home program, and most recently the CARES housing voucher program. And so our work is really part of CVOEO's broader work to address the fundamental issues of racial, economic, and social justice. And our program does a few different things. We do direct education, so similar to what the Human Rights Commission does, to make sure that everyone understands the fair housing rights and responsibilities. So we do trainings for housing providers and service providers and the general public, community members. And we also provide support and referrals for people experiencing housing discrimination. And we partner with the Legal Aid and the Human Rights Commission and the U.S. Attorney's Office, who are the enforcement partners in this work. We also do, through our Thriving Communities campaign, address some of the more systemic issues, trying to increase awareness of the importance of inclusive, affordable housing, and then working on the local level with local housing committees around the state to help them address their housing needs and look at issues of need and discrimination within their communities. So a little bit about me. I'm relatively new to the housing world. I've only been working in housing for a few years. I came to this work with a background in community journalism and food justice. And so two things that are focused on are very community-based. And, so in the housing work, I'm really realizing how safe and stable and affordable homes are so important for just the fabric of our communities, and that we can't have strong and connected communities without safe and secure housing. And so many people don't have access to that safe and secure housing. And so it creates this ripple effect, this effect on health and on civic engagement. So this work is very, very, very important and personal to me for many reasons. And I also would like to note too that I had the privilege of learning the fair housing ropes from Ted Wimpy, the previous director of the Fair Housing Project, who played a significant role in shaping Vermont's affordable and fair housing landscape. So I just wanted to give a nod to Ted and to the people who have been doing this work for far longer than I have. So, thank you.
Thank you both. I just want to share with the people who are here today a little bit about the Human Rights Commission. So for those of you who don't know, the Human Rights Commission is a state entity that was enacted by statute almost 30 years ago. I mean, more than 30 years ago. We have a staff of 6 who, which includes myself, our Amanda, our director of policy, John, who's our executive staff assistant, and our 3 staff attorney investigators, Cassie, Nelson, and Melissa, who are all here today too. We also have 5 commissioners who are appointed by the governor, and their primary job is to hire the executive director, assist the executive director with setting the policy agenda, and then hear the cases that come before them and make determinations on discrimination. Our mission at the Human Rights Commission is to promote full civil and human rights, and in 3 primary areas: housing, obviously, but also state government employment and public accommodations. And I just wanted to share also that the Civil Rights Unit at the Attorney General's office would cover employment discrimination in all other cases other than state government employment. And places of public accommodations has a really huge definition, expansive definition in Vermont, and rightfully so. It includes businesses, it includes restaurants, but also schools and hospitals and public offices and prisons and roads as well. So in addition to housing, those are the other areas that we cover, which keeps us pretty busy. We have 4 statutory mandates enforce the anti-discrimination laws of the state. We do that through our investigations, and we do that through litigation. We also have a requirement to really work hard to conciliate cases and help the parties reach an agreement. We do a significant amount of education outreach, which is why we're putting on the Civil Rights Conference. And an important part of our work is also to advance policies that protect Vermont's most vulnerable populations. And so we're pretty busy during the legislative session because we're providing information to the legislature about bills that we think are harmful and bills that we think are useful and helpful also. So that's, in a nutshell, what the Human Rights Commission does, but I would know that we'll have an opportunity later to answer any questions about how a case gets through the HRC if that comes up. Before I do that, I want to turn to the Fair Housing Act, both the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Vermont Fair Housing Act, and ask Rachel to give us a little bit of an overview of the law.
So I wanted to start, before I get to the statutes, just to say again that housing is key to everything else. If you think of Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy of needs, the bottom 2 tiers are all about safe, stable housing. So if you don't have that, you don't have anything. And then we talked a lot in the last session about affordable housing and the importance of your housing being affordable to you. And I think in this session, we're We're talking more about some of the questions people raised about, first of all, where housing is built, and also where people are allowed to live or where they're allowed to move. So that kind of agency question that came up in the last session a bit. So there's two statutes, a federal statute and a Vermont statute that follows it. The federal statute was passed in 1968. It's part of the Civil Rights Act, and it was the last part of the Civil Rights Act passed. It didn't pass until after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and there were riots. And finally, that got Congress to finally enact the Fair Housing Act. It was the most resisted part of the Civil Rights Act. The Vermont Fair Housing Act was passed in 1986, and it, like I said, it follows the federal act in the sense that it's similar and cases are interpreted similarly under it. It has some more prohibited bases or things that you can't discriminate against someone based on. They're both broad remedial statutes, meaning they were created to get rid of discrimination throughout the United States, or Vermont in Vermont's case. And they're interpreted broadly. It bars discrimination by anyone, against anyone, about any dwelling. And dwelling is expansively defined. It includes planning and zoning. It includes mortgages and lending and private home sales. So it's not just something that applies to publicly financed housing. It applies to everything. It even applies to things like homeless shelters in certain circumstances. It only protects against discrimination based on the things that are listed in the statute. And those are, I'm gonna do them from memory so you guys can jump in if I miss something: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, which includes sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as traditional sex discrimination in the sense of, I won't rent to you because you're a woman kind of thing, as well as sexual harassment. Having children, minors that will reside with the primary householders, having a disability, and then under Vermont law, marital status and age, and receipt of public assistance, which includes receiving housing assistance like Section 8 voucher or a COVID SASH, I forget the name of them, but the vouchers under the CRF funds. And the kinds of discrimination that occur are things like it's prohibited to advertise in a discriminatory way. So you can't say, I won't rent to kids, or I won't rent to people of color, or I won't sell to people of color. It covers all kinds of housing. Denying housing, harassing people while they live in housing, having different terms or conditions in that housing, like charging more rent for one person than another based on one of these prohibited bases, termination of contracts or leases. And then there's a special category for people with disabilities of requiring housing providers to provide reasonable accommodations or modifications, which are changes in rules or policies or physical structures to allow people with disabilities to access housing.
Thanks, Rachel. I forgot that I skipped a part of the question earlier about myself and what connects me to this work. But the truth is, I talk about it all the time, and I think maybe people are sick of it. So maybe it's unnecessary. And I mentioned it also in my welcoming remarks yesterday too, is I have experienced housing discrimination. I have had landlords tell me that they don't want to rent to me because I have small children. I've had landlords treat me differently, and that they've asked me to provide additional documentation that I later learned on that other tenants weren't asked to provide. I also have really struggled with housing more than I've ever struggled before since moving to Vermont 5 years ago. And I think that a lot has to do with the lack of affordable housing. Also that you know, you could live so far apart, there's not a lot of homes available. When you have a lot of criteria such as a price range, but also wanting to be in a school district and thinking about your kids and transportation and proximity to work. And I'm married and my spouse works in one area of the state and I work in a different area. And so there's so many criteria that goes into it that has made housing really not even accessible to me. And also because I've experienced housing discrimination in Vermont, that I also know what the barriers are, and they're very real. And I just wanted to share like a story of looking for a rental. Once we had sort of decided that we liked a certain school and we had kind of built a community in that school, and we needed to find a place to live, there was only one like rental available in like 3 to 4 towns that could keep us in that school. And so if the landlord was discriminating, you're not going to bring a discrimination lawsuit against that landlord because you need that housing. And so when I hear people share about the barriers, I have a really real connection to that. And I have other stories too, but I won't bore you with that. I want to sort of talk to you, Jess, a little bit about the work that you do at Champlain Valley. And if you can kind of just tell us what you see as the current landscape of fair housing through your work.
Sure. Thanks, Bor. So I think it's first to think about, what's the housing landscape in Vermont, and we heard a lot about that in the last panel. But I wanted to just touch on a few points that I think we should keep in mind. Just as you mentioned before, there's really a lack of affordability and availability of housing in Vermont of all types, and especially housing that's most affordable. And we're looking at about half of renters are paying more than 30% of their income for housing, and half of those again are paying more than 50% of their income for housing. And the gap in homeowners is a little lower but similar, where half of homeowners are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing. Meanwhile, the recent housing needs assessment done by VHFA for the state of Vermont showed that non-white households were more likely to face housing challenges. No surprise there, based on our what we see every day, and that when you look at the homeownership rate for white households, it's about 71%, but the homeownership rate for Black households in Vermont is 22%, and that compares to 42% nationally. Similarly, Vermont has a disproportionate number of non-white people experiencing homelessness. So 15% of those identified in the last point in time count were non-white, compared to 5% of the total population. And LGBTQ plus people with disabilities, those who've experienced violence are also disproportionately affected, and we see more representation in the numbers of people experiencing homelessness. And all this was true before COVID, and it's now really magnified in this moment that we're in now. We call it a moment. It's our new reality. And so in this tight housing market where people are really priced out of homes and struggling to gain that basic stability for themselves and their families, it creates an environment where those with the lowest incomes, who tend to be more likely in protected classes, have an even tougher time finding and keeping housing. And so that shows up as how that shows up is that there's a lot of discrimination that happens that is not reported, where exactly what you were saying before, Bor, where if there's only one apartment available and that landlord is acting inappropriately, is discriminating, is breaking federal and state fair housing law, it's very difficult to take action to remedy that if you really need that housing. And what we see is a lot of the time that people are in really precarious housing situations and are being discriminated against and don't necessarily see a path forward other than just putting up with it so that they can get into or keep a home. And I think we'll we'll be talking more in a few minutes about what that discrimination looks like. But we get many calls to our Fair Housing line and to our Vermont Tenants Hotline from people who are facing discrimination of all types, based on having children, based on where they come from, what language they speak, their disabilities, their sexual orientation, their gender identities, and they just don't know what to do, because the steps, there are specific steps that we can advise them on to file an official complaint, which would be referring them to the Human Rights Commission, referring them to legal aid or other places to go through a testing, investigation, and mediation, or perhaps court process. And those are all really important, but they might not help those people solve their immediate problem, which is they need a home for themselves and their families tomorrow. So we see a lot of people who are sort of caught in the middle, who are facing discrimination and don't see a clear way forward for how to resolve that.
Thanks, Jess. Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about what the cases look like at Vermont Legal Aid? What kind of cases do you see in this area?
Sure. So we receive about 100 complaints a year, a little more than 100 complaints a year that have a basic claim of fair housing or housing discrimination. The majority of those are actually reasonable accommodation claims. So those are where someone with a disability has asked for an accommodation or a modification. Usually it's more accommodations and modifications in their housing, and that's been denied. So that's a huge proportion of the cases. That's true nationally as well. The next biggest category is families with children. So discrimination based on having minors that live with you. Having kids, and then race, color is the next biggest. And it's interesting that all of these bases are in one statute, but they actually factually come in different ways, which kind of makes sense probably makes more sense if you have lived experience, because like someone was saying about talking about all people of color as being in one group, they're not. No group isn't a monolithic thing. We're individuals, and there's also subgroups. So for example, with race color discrimination, it's more common to have what we sometimes call handshake and a smile discrimination. So someone applies for housing and they're not told no, nothing discriminatory is said to them. They're just told, oh, I'm sorry, I would have loved to rent to you, but that place is already taken. And the only way that that person would know that that was something discriminatory happened there was if you followed up to find out that they didn't say that same thing to someone who applied later who was white. So that's basically what we do. That's one of the basic investigative tools that we use when we're trying to see whether housing discrimination has occurred. So unfortunately, a lot of that discrimination, if you don't do that kind of thing, and it can be done informally, you can have a friend call, it doesn't have to be done by an official testing organization. That's the only way you will know that you were discriminated against, because people are, know enough generally not to come out and say openly racist things in so many words. So it's a sad part of the reality. And I would say of the people who are the least likely to pursue their claims, African Americans are the highest in my experience, because it's sad, but I know that basically what they generally say is, this is something that happens all the time. I'm aware that it happens all the time. I've been down this road before. It's not worth the trauma that it's going to cause me to think about it every day, to pursue it. I'm just going to go on with my life and, forget them, which is a perfectly rational response. So that's makes it harder to enforce the Fair Housing Act if people, for good reasons, don't want to pursue a legal case. I'll just say another group that has a high rate of discrimination is people based on national origin. And often those are people of color as well. So not always, but pretty often we'll have African immigrants or immigrants from Southeast Asia. And some of the things I hear there are just actually once they're in the housing. And one of the ones I've heard the most, which is just really, I find really upsetting, is people, either landlords or other tenants or neighbors in condos, disparaging people's food and trying to get them to stop cooking their food because they think it smells bad. And it's just such a personal affront to, I mean, it shocks me that anyone feels like they can go and say that to anyone else in the first place, but I've heard it multiple times. So it's not like it was an isolated situation. And that's the other one I've heard is you don't know how to use these appliances because you don't have them where you come from, that from a landlord. So I've heard that more than once also. When we did testing, the last time we published a report on our testing, we found that there was a rate of discrimination in trying to apply for housing of 48% based on national origin, 36% based on race. And within the national origin, which we did by linguistic profiling or identifying, having focus groups identify the national origin of the person speaking and then using those people in these tests. That was a little convoluted, so I can explain it better if people need me to, but the rate of discrimination against the Kenyan woman tester was the highest at 56%. So we don't know because we didn't check, we didn't have a Kenyan male tester to compare to say was partly that due to being a woman, but it was extremely high. And I will say that legally this is really virtually impossible to, you really can't make an argument for sort of intersectionality or stacking, but in fact, that's what we see. So for example, I represented a woman who was African-American, had disabilities, had a live-in aid, had kids with disabilities, and had a Section 8 voucher. And the way it was analyzed by the judge, which I think is kind of the way the law works, is each thing on its own basis. Whereas I feel like it was actually the combination of factors together that made the person even more likely to be discriminated against. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of some of what I see. We do see some sexual orientation and gender identity cases, probably about two a year combined. Religion we usually see combined with national origin discrimination. I don't think I've ever seen an age or marital status discrimination case. And then we do get sexual harassment cases, and I was just saying how these cases come in sort of different fact patterns, and the weird thing to me about sexual harassment is that I've never seen a case that came in. Every case that I've ever seen that came in of sexual harassment also involved serious health and safety problems at the housing, which I've sort of come to the conclusion that it's like the kind of landlord who does not keep their place up to code is the same kind of landlord that would sexually harass women, but that's just my guess.
Rachel, you mentioned testing, and I think there might be some folks here today who are new to that idea. Can you talk a little bit about your testing program and what is testing and how do you go about like setting up a test?
Sure. So we use a lot of different investigative tools, but testing specifically is based on the scientific model, but not really. The purpose of it is to assess the presence of discrimination and also to potentially have evidence that's admissible in court in a case. So the standard is different than a scientific model, I guess is what I'd start with. But basically what we do is say we wanted to see how a certain, we'll just say landlord treats African Americans. We would send an African American man out to apply for the housing and pretend this is a person that isn't looking for housing, but they pretend that they want the housing. Then they come back and they talk to our testing coordinator. And then after they've gone out, we send a white man out to apply for the same housing. And then they come back and talk to the testing coordinator. And then the testing coordinator creates a lot of documents and then passes that on to me to compare how were the people treated, how, you know, there's various things that happen. I mean, there can be the outright, it's not available, it is available. That would be really obvious. Sometimes you get direct statements, especially when it comes to children and people with disabilities, you get statements because people think they're being helpful. Like, we don't think this is a great place for kids because there isn't a big yard or whatever. They're basically substituting their judgment for the parents. In any case, so that's the basic model. It's using a subject and a control to try to assess what's actually happening.
At the Human Rights Commission, we don't do any sort of testing, but when we talk about it and do our trainings, we talk about the difficulty of testing in Vermont because of the lack of housing and how quickly housing is off the market. And also informal housing practices. So if landlords put their homes on the market to, if they put it on Craigslist or they put it on Front Porch Forum or Picket Fence or something like that, usually then there's notice of that. But oftentimes there's a lot of landlords in Vermont who rent through word of mouth. And so you're not necessarily able to test those cases where there's an informal practice. And also because homes are off the market so fast that you can't necessarily get in there to test also. In order for testing to be credible evidence, you have to make sure that it's uniform. And so that you almost have to train your actors, your control and your tester to make sure that the script is almost the same as well, and that you're not changing the variables and stuff. And so testing is really hard and especially difficult in Vermont because of those factors. So then how do you prove a discrimination case and what does it look like? So I'll talk a little bit about like what we look for at the Human Rights Commission. So when someone calls into the Human Rights Commission and they say, I've been discriminated against in housing, one, we look to see, is it based on the protected status? And Rachel sort of listed those statuses like disability, race, color, and so forth. You just have to allege it, but we also seek to see if there's like language that was used that could support that, or even the allegation that there was someone else who was treated differently. And you don't have to prove it at the time of the intake. Later on, we look to see if there's a way to prove it, but not at the time of intake. The bar is low to get in the door to open an investigation at the Human Rights Commission. And we try to keep that in mind. We look to see if the dwelling is something that is covered under the law. And for the most part it is. There are a few exemptions to that, which I won't get into, but for the most part, most dwellings are covered. And then we ask questions about discriminatory statements. And Rachel did mention that there are still cases where there are discriminatory statements. And most of the time it's minor children. It's also people who want to live in a home with minor children. You often do hear landlords in Vermont saying, I don't want to rent to you. I'm really saving this place for empty nesters. You know, the children are naughty. I've got this balcony. I've got this lake. It's right off the road. This isn't really suitable for kids. And so they do still make very discriminatory statements like that when it comes to people who want to rent with children. Another area where we see a lot of explicitly discriminatory statements is public assistance. We do see a fair amount of ads that are no Section 8. Or I won't take disability benefits, or I don't want to deal with the government in terms of trying to get paid and things like that. And so we do find discriminatory statements there as well. When you don't have discriminatory statements, like that. How do you prove that you were discriminated against? Oftentimes, we look for a comparator during the investigation. We look to see if someone else was treated, someone outside of the protected class was treated in a different way. So I mentioned earlier to you all that I had been asked by landlords to provide additional documentation. And then later on, I found out that other tenants didn't have to provide those same things, right? That's an example of different treatment. Different treatment can also be after you've already obtained housing. It could be your landlord won't accept late payment from you, but will accept a late payment from somebody else. Or your landlord allows white tenants to listen to their music, but then cites you for noise when you're listening to your music in your language. That could be national origin discrimination as well. And so we often are seeking out a comparator when there isn't explicit discriminatory statements. But you can see that that can be really difficult. If you're looking at someone who applied for housing, how do you find the other folks who also applied as well? If it's informal, if the landlord didn't accept a bunch of application, that could be really difficult to prove. And so I don't want to suggest that it's easy in any way, but I also don't want to suggest that it's impossible. It certainly is possible. We do find that people do discriminate. I want to emphasize something that Rachel mentioned too, which is when Vermont Legal Aid issued their report on testing, she said like they were seeing 48%, like, or 56% in the case of the Kenyan woman tester. We're talking about like half the time people are being discriminated against in Vermont. 50% of the time, people who are Black and people who are considered not from here, not American, not Vermont, are being discriminated. So it is very, very, very prevalent. Discrimination is very prevalent, and we know it's happening against these people.
How do you stop being sad about loneliness? I'm like only done this for one.
Sorry, Bor. Can you unmute yourself now?
Thank you. Yeah. Where did I leave off? Just what was I proving discrimination, right? I want to talk a little bit also about disparate impact versus disparate treatment. So when someone files a claim of discrimination, sometimes what we've been talking so far about has been disparate treatment, which is trying to prove that someone was treated differently on the basis of a protected status, race, color, national origin, age, survivor of domestic violence, or something like that. But disparate impact is also another type of discrimination case that someone could bring to. And usually that means that there's some type of neutral policy or practice, but it has a discriminatory impact on a group of people. An example of that might be a landlord that says, I only want to rent to people who've had a rental history for at least 5 years. It's neutral because there's no protected status that you have to, there's no protected status implicated there. The policy is just, I want to rent to someone who has a rental history, right? It sounds neutral. It's not racist or sexist or discriminatory in any way. At least it's not initially suggestive of that. But it's possible that a policy like that actually has a disparate impact on a group of people, maybe age, right? So if you're 18 or 19 or 20, you may not have 5 years of rental history. Okay. Another example of that is criminal background checks. People who have a history of, who have a criminal history are not currently protected under our fair housing laws, either at the federal level or at the state level. But it is possible to potentially make an argument that when landlords engage in criminal background checks, that they are discriminating against certain groups of people. Particularly, we know that because of prosecutorial decisions and police actions that Black and brown people are disproportionately targeted by the police and prosecuted and charged differently. And so those disparities exist in our criminal justice system. And so of course they're going to show up when there are criminal background checks completed and done as well. So when you have a landlord that says, I'm going to do criminal background checks, that policy seems neutral, but it might have a disparate impact on a certain group of people. To prove disparate impact, it's a statistics-based kind of case, and it could be hard to prove. And under the Trump administration, it's become almost impossible to prove disparate impact too. So we rarely see that. One, you need statistics, and two, the standards for proving disparate impact have become really difficult and impossible to show. So we usually see disparate treatment type cases at the Human Rights Commission. As Rachel mentioned, the majority of them are disability cases. That's not just true in Vermont, that's true at the federal, national level as well. HUD sees a significant amount of discriminatory cases. And while people with disabilities can be discriminated against in the same way that people people can be discriminated against on the basis of race or national origin, and that you just have a landlord who doesn't want to rent to someone, or like a lender who doesn't want to lend money to someone or something like that. The reality is the reason why we see a heightened amount of discriminatory cases against people with disabilities is because of reasonable accommodations and modifications, right? Someone who has a disability has the right to ask their landlord for a reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification of structures and so forth. And then the landlord only has so many reasons why they can deny that. And so the law just happens to be a little bit more expansive to cover that area, which is why we see a lot of those cases at the Human Rights Commission. Having said that, we have seen an uptick in race cases, and we've seen some uptick in national origin as well. We're working on our annual report, so kind of stay tuned for that too. It'll be a chance for us to kind of look back at the last fiscal year and see what kind of cases that we've gotten. So yeah, and disparate treatment also includes harassment, which is holding other tenants responsible for engaging in a hostile housing environment, and also holding landlords responsible for not responding appropriately when people are harassing each other on the basis of a protected status. And so the fair housing laws, both at the state level and at the federal level, cover harassment. And when someone calls us and says they are experiencing harassment, either because of their national origin or race or disability, we look to see whether we should name the landlord, the other tenant, the other homeowners, or all of the above. And something important to remember here too is that this isn't just about rentals. The Fair Housing Act also covers homeowners in this sense, in that you can actually hold your neighbors who own their home responsible for harassing you, who also, if you own your home as well. And that's important. And what's sad is under the current administration, we have seen more and more of those kinds of explicitly biased cases. To prove harassment, it can be very hard. The standard is similar to the employment standard, is severe or pervasive. But having said that, we see it. And so I just encourage people to learn more about the fair housing laws and their rights and duties as well. So I've talked for a while now. Rachel, I want to turn to you and talk about, like, how do you detect housing discrimination? And you've talked a little bit about testing already, but what do you look for as an attorney at Vermont Legal Aid? And what is the process like at Vermont Legal Aid for someone who has experienced discrimination in housing?
So it begins with the first call when, like you said, for the Human Rights Commission, the bar is really low just to talk to us and to find out what happened and to get some advice about what your rights are, and then make a decision, an informed decision about what you want to do. So what we do is we first talk to the person who was discriminated against and hear their story and get from them whether there might have been any witnesses to the actual event or anybody that they spoke to really close in time to the event, or if they happen to know of anyone else who has had a similar experience with that housing provider. We use housing provider broadly to mean landlord, realtor, bank, so anybody covered by the Fair Housing Act, basically. So we look for other witnesses. If it's a case of trying to get an apartment, that's a case where we would do testing. So we would try to immediately send out testers to see if they're treated the same. And like Boris said, Vermont is really challenging because the vacancy rate is so low that housing turns over really fast. So by the time the person calls us and gives us the ad and we send testers out, we sometimes will not be able to find anything because basically both testers are told that it's not available anymore, which is pretty believable because of the market. And when the control tester is told the same as the protected, there's no evidence there of discrimination. That doesn't mean there wasn't discrimination, it just means you didn't get any additional evidence of it. We try to talk to all those people and see what kind of evidence there is of various kinds. And then we talk to the person about what the evidence shows, how hard these cases are to prove and what the process will look like, and what they would like to do. So for us, we're private lawyers, so it's always up to the person whether they want to pursue the case or not pursue the case. And many people decide not to. Another thing that happens when people are looking for housing is that we tell them about the whole process, and they often decide, instead of trying to get a court order that says that the housing provider has to rent to them, they will decide to find a place and wait and think about bringing a lawsuit after they're settled into a new place. So the main reason that people actually pursue housing discrimination cases is to help other people, because they don't want that to happen to somebody else. And so they will get settled in their new housing, and then they will come back to us and we'll start a case at that point. And we have up to a year to file with HUD or the Human Rights Commission, and up to 2 years to file in state or federal court. So there's some time in there for people to do that process. If we think we have enough that, there's something there, and we file a case, if we file it in court, we then have a whole process within civil litigation where we get to get a lot more information from the other side. And so if we feel like there's enough there, we can then count on finding more after we've filed. And that's kind of an important part of the calculus about going forward. And then the other thing about civil cases is, in contrast to criminal justice, in the civil system, most cases in the civil system actually settle. So, and that can happen at any point in the process. So, and all through that process, we're checking in with the plaintiff or client to see, do you want to continue? Do you want to make an offer? And giving them our assessment of the evidence. I wanted to just touch on remedies because the Fair Housing Act is a broad remedial statute. You are entitled to pretty broad remedies, much more so than in regular civil litigation, which is almost always just money damages. In fair housing cases, you can actually get an order for the people to go to fair housing training, to do affirmative marketing, to put up signs that say you have fair housing rights, There's a variety of things you can get in addition to just money damages, which is what most civil litigation comes down to. And that's something that private attorneys generally don't realize, so we have to show them all the cases that say that's the case. But the nice thing about that is that people, because generally their motivation is that this doesn't happen to other people, they feel better about the idea that the person that did the discriminating is at least going to have to take a class, even if they don't learn anything from it. And so that can happen as a result of a court order, or it can happen as a result of settlement. The other thing about the Fair Housing Act is it's what's called a fee shifting statute. So if the plaintiff or the person who brings the case prevails or wins on any claim, the other side has to pay the lawyer's fees of the plaintiff. So that's also a disincentive. So the act of suing someone over this can actually be a disincentive, because in addition to paying monetary damages for the distress and the dignitary harm of fair housing discrimination, they also have to pay fees and costs. So it adds up to the amount of money that they're having to pay out in order to either resolve the case or as a result of losing the case. I don't know if I missed anything there. Hopefully not.
No, that was great. Thank you for talking about remedies too. And at the Human Rights Commission, the remedies can be very varied. If we are working on settling the case with the parties, we definitely push for training and education and policy changes. And a lot of times you just have housing providers who just don't even have policies. And so we're pushing for them to actually adopt written policies and post those policies, which are really important so that tenants know what their rights are as well. But the remedies can include monetary damages, and that can be really, money speaks. Let's just say that. Money holds people accountable, money speaks. When things cost people money, they pay attention, and typically they don't make those same mistakes again. And then people get to walk away with money. And money matters in Vermont if you're a tenant. You need that money as a deposit in your next rental. Also, sometimes, I would say this is really important too, is that because housing is scarce, a lot of times complainants really just want housing. So the housing is still available, or if they're in the housing currently, but they're experiencing harassment, or they're dealing with a landlord who wants to try to evict them for a discriminatory reason, their number one goal is not become houseless. And while we do have a interest at the HRC to protect all Vermonters, not just the complaining parties, there's always a competing thing between protecting all Vermonters and the public's interest versus protecting this particular individual who needs to maintain their housing. And so we often tend to yield towards the complainant who says, I just want this housing. They're not willing to pay money. I just want to stay here another year, or get me through the winter months before I can move out. And that often is sometimes the remedy that comes out of these settlement agreements. But I want to highlight that a couple years ago, we settled a case involving it was, when it was opened at the Human Rights Commission, it was both race discrimination and discrimination on the basis of minor children. Personally, I believe race discrimination occurred, but proving that was difficult, and we were able to show that at least there was discrimination on the basis of an intent to reside with minor children, and we were able to settle that case for $26,000, which was really helpful to the complainant and her family. And so, and that brings up the fact that people can belong in multiple protected categories, and some are easier to prove than others. So sometimes we do think that race discrimination occurred, but this individual also has a psychiatric disability, and that's an easier claim to prove. And so then they get the remedy because of that, as opposed to another protected category. but certainly intersectionality is real and it exists. I think we've come to probably the question of the hour, which is why hasn't the Fair Housing Act in Vermont and the Federal Fair Housing Act, it's been here since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Why hasn't it eradicated housing discrimination nationally or in Vermont? And Jess, we haven't heard from you in a while, so I'm going to start with you and then Rachel.
Sure, thanks, Bor. Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Why does it still exist? And for a lot of the reasons that we've been talking about, there's discrimination is systemic. It's part of a lot of these systems that we've created connected to housing. Housing is created and built and sold and rented. There's implicit bias in lending and renting, where people have these deeply rooted associations between race, disability, gender identity, et cetera, and the level of risk in lending or renting to people. There's this implicit bias in our community, and it's also built into algorithms that are more frequently being used for credit checks, for and other financial related processes that are related to housing. There's the issue of unreported and undocumented housing discrimination. So we have these laws that have a certain amount of teeth, but they can only be enforced when the cases are brought into the legal system. And when things aren't brought into the legal system, the laws aren't enforced, and it creates this cycle. There's also, the institutional biases. So, for example, here in Vermont, one of the we have a fairly unique protected class, a unique protection that prohibits basing land use decisions on the income of prospective residents. But there's really not much awareness about that protection, and so it isn't well enforced. I don't think it's ever been, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's ever been a court case related to that. And where that can come into play is even recent examples like with CRF funding and new initiatives in Vermont to create housing for people experiencing homelessness during the pandemic, where local bodies can have tried to stop that housing because it's serving people who are of lower incomes. And so that is in violation of Vermont's fair housing law, but that doesn't really get enforced. Some of the bigger issues of structural racism and discrimination, they're historical. They're both historical, that were existed before the Fair Housing Act was passed. There were fair housing protections legally on the books in this country dating back to 1866, where there were laws put into place to allow former slaves to enter into legal contracts in housing. So legally, it's been illegal for hundreds of years to discriminate against someone based on race in their housing, but the initial laws weren't enforced. There was no enforcement mechanism, and then with the Fair Housing Act in 1968, at least there was an enforcement mechanism put into that. But this the discrimination is part of our, unfortunately, is part of how we do business in this country. And then a lot of the protections that were built into the Fair Housing Act have been eroded, particularly with this current administration. There's been the dismantling of the affirmatively furthering fair housing provisions of the Fair Housing Act. The disparate impact rule, which you mentioned before, also the equal access rule, which provides protections based on gender identity in in housing, particularly in shelters, and then also the the recent executive order against racial equity trainings. So all of these things are eroding some of these really important protections that are put into law and making them harder and harder to enforce, when we should be going in the other direction, and actually making it easier to enforce the Fair Housing Act and increasing awareness of all of our rights. And so I don't know if I'm allowed a little political commentary, but I'm hoping in the next administration that some of those things would be, that some of these decisions would be reversed, and we can put some teeth back into our Fair Housing Act.
Yeah, I think I just, I agree with all of that. And then to add to it that despite sort of what we like to think, the law is actually not always the most effective tool for social change. It can be a useful tool. It definitely can be a powerful tool. But for many reasons, including the burden of proof and other things, it has limited efficacy. And especially when you're talking about one-on-one individual discrimination. I think where it actually has more power is in the area of land use planning. Sorry, I saw a comment that I want to respond to, so I got distracted. We've actually been pretty successful in submitting sub-public comments to municipalities when they're objecting to the building of affordable housing or shelters, or saying they have to be in the commercial area or things like that. And I think that when you can change public policy, that is a really useful aspect of the legal protection. And I want to say, sort of maybe on a hopeful note, that I think that if we, on a policy level, build housing that is inclusive and that is affordable, so that affordable housing isn't located in its own ghetto, that kids grow up together and they're less likely to have all these implicit biases that those of us who grew up in segregated communities have, because they have personal experience to counteract all of the negative messages that they get from society at large. And I think that's ultimately the solution to changing things and making the world better.
Thank you both. I just wanted to add to that, what you both have really already said is that even though we called the Fair Housing Act a remedial statute, it really didn't remedy discrimination, right? And the idea that after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, that we're now going to pass this comprehensive law that says you can live anywhere you want to and no one can discriminate against you, is one, you can't just stop racists from being racist by passing a law. And two, you can say, hey, you as a Black and brown person can now buy into any neighborhood you want. The reality is that they still couldn't. One, the difference in terms of the accumulation of wealth, the fact that they're still discriminated against in employment, the fact that they're still paid a tiny percentage, even to this day, what white people earn. And so it didn't really fix systemic issues. It was designed to really fix individual racism, and even then it doesn't do an adequate job of really fixing that. It's a slow, passing a law is a slow way to resolve like cultural shifts and cultural changes. And then also what happens is our legislators pass these laws that look really good, and then our courts, which are primarily white men who are in the judiciary, are then interpreting these laws in such a way that makes it so difficult for women and minorities to actually win their discrimination cases. And so it's impossible, really. So it's impossible in terms of addressing systemic racism and systemic discrimination. But having said that, I do think that we can actually fix the problem. And I think that's really the next question is, how do we fix this? How do we fix this? What could this look like moving forward? And I want to start with back to you, Jess, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think a big piece of it is education and outreach and making sure that that everyone knows about the rights that exist, and it's education, not just for the general public and people experiencing discrimination, but for landlords, for housing providers, for service providers. And it's also a piece, it's a piece of this bigger work that we need to be doing around racial equity and social justice. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is changing the public will, just helping us all understand more what affordable housing is, why it's important, where it could and should be, understanding the value of inclusive affordable housing and how communities are stronger when we have a diversity of people of different backgrounds and incomes and abilities and preferences and everything. And so, and we need more housing in general. If there is more housing, it'll be easier to prove discrimination, but it also makes it easier if there are more homes available for everyone, then there are fewer other pressures and makes it easier for people to not have to put up with discrimination and have other choices in their homes. And it's also, we need to think about equity. This came up at the earlier panel too, thinking about equity in housing and not just equality, and who has been focusing on rising up people who have experienced the most discrimination and making things even more available. There's a note in the chat that I just want to respond to from Leah saying, education baloney, Mark is right, strengthen the laws. Yes, we need to do both, but they go hand in hand too. There's also, I'd like to call out a comment that Dawn made earlier, asking whether there are restorative justice approaches towards fair housing. Enforcement remediation. I think that could be something really good to explore too. So I think, combination of education and enforcement, we need to make it easier for people to report and have access to the resources to make complaints and have those complaints go through the system. And yes, okay, I will stop now and turn it over to Rachel.
So someone, maybe it was yesterday, in one of the panels said, basically you all are the problem, and he was right. So speaking to all of the white people like me, that the reason racism exists is it's in us, so we're the ones that need to do the work to make our implicit bias conscious and work on it. So that's number one. Number two, yeah, I think some really big monetary awards in court cases would be great because that's a real disincentive. If serious money if someone gets serious money in a discrimination case, it sends a message, a very strong message to people that it's a bad idea to discriminate. And then I guess back to the thing I said before about being on a public policy level, really focusing on using the power of government and the power of government money to invest in a way that creates inclusive communities rather than segregated communities. And we're really fortunate in Vermont because we're relatively undeveloped relative to the rest of the country. So we don't have these entrenched patterns of segregation. We have kind of a growing trend towards that in the Burlington, Old North End, Winooski area, but not really an entrenched version like you see in the rest of the country. So we have an opportunity to avoid that. Oh, I wanted to respond to the just cause question. So yes, just cause or something along those lines is critical not just to fair housing rights, but to all tenants' rights. If you can be evicted for no reason at all, you basically don't assert your rights. So whether it's the right to a place that is up to the health code, or the right to not be discriminated against, or any of the rights that you have in law, if you can be evicted for no cause, you're not going to assert them. So just cause is very important to helping tenants to be able to assert their fair housing rights.
Before I answer that, I think I see a question for you, Rachel. Do you want to?
Yeah, I just saw Mark's question. Yes, that was what our what our testing showed, and this is fairly older testing at this point. It was done in 2013, but what it showed, we did have different groups. We had African American testers, and we had immigrant testers with foreign accents. So we had two different groups, and they were not counted the same. There was slightly lower discrimination against African Americans than against New Americans or immigrants, people with a foreign accent. And the Kenyan woman had the highest rate of discrimination. But the rates were all very, very high.
And the Kenyan woman was a national origin test, not, just to clarify, not race.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's right. And I should say that when we did our focus groups, I didn't go into this level of detail before, but it's actually in Vermont, I think people are just, there are exceptions, of course, that people have lived internationally, but a large number of people can't distinguish between one accent and another. So the person could be from Ireland or from Jamaica or from Cameroon, and they just, oh, I don't know, they're not from here, is all they can hear. So not everyone could differentiate that person was a Kenyan woman or even an African woman. They just knew that it was a woman with a foreign accent, a large number of them.
I'm going to try my best to try to answer the question of how do we where do we go from here and how do we change? And I am a firm believer that when you have lived experiences, that informs your decision making, but it also makes your commitment unwavering in terms of equity and justice and discrimination. And when you lack those experiences, then I would also say that your commitment might waver, especially when you're dealing with competing demands, and your passion might waver and your motivation might waver, and you don't have lived experiences to draw from when you're making decisions. I absolutely believe that not only can we change our laws to make it easier for people to prevail in discrimination cases, and I would suggest that you support sort of any of those kinds of changes at the legislature and call your legislators about changing the standards for meeting like a hostile housing environment case or a harassment case in employment, as well as public accommodations and in housing. But we need more BIPOC people at the legislature. We need more BIPOC people in positions of power and in the judiciary. And so you need to and we need to pass laws that actually address directly the problem. So if we know that passing the Fair Housing Act really didn't address systemic racism, then we need to actually think about how do we address those disparities in income, and how do we address economic disparities. Now that we say that if you're Black, you can buy into any neighborhood you want, but you don't have the money, how do we ensure that someone who is Black does then have the money and to do that? Oftentimes what we do is we try to indirectly fix the problem. And so I'll give you an example of this. Last year, and Erhard mentioned it, and they talked a little bit about it in the last session, they tried to add housing status, houselessness, as a protected category under the Fair Housing Act. Now, we support that. Of course we do. Of course we want to protect people who are houseless. But that's not the problem. Houseless people's primary problem is finding housing. It's not being added as a protected status and putting it on the jurisdiction of the HRC to review and investigate. The HRC isn't going to fix houselessness. What's going to fix houselessness is housing. And so we sometimes try to indirectly address issues like that. And so I think that what we really need to figure out is how do we fix figuring out what the problem is, listening to the people who are most impacted by that problem, and then go, how do we fix this? How do we resolve that? And what do you need? And I think that is listening to the people who are most impacted. And so I think that's really important. I think that we can do that. I always remain hopeful that there's a way forward to eradicate discrimination. I want to save a little bit of time. We don't have much time left for questions from the audience, either in the chat or you can unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm just going to jump in here. I'm Emily Collins. I'm a civil rights outreach specialist with the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to kind of jump in, introduce myself, and provide the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Program as another venue that people can kind of just another option for if people do find themselves in a situation where they are looking to file a complaint, something's happened to them. We enforce federal civil rights, so that includes the Federal Fair Housing Act. And I'll plug our the link to our website with our complaint form into the chat. But I just want to jump in here and just let people know that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Vermont is also another avenue.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you for being here today.
And thank you.
Hey, Boar.
Hey.
Thanks for this. This is pretty good. I was multitasking at the same time, but I was listening, definitely listening. I'm going to turn my video off because I have weak internet here. But I wanted to just echo what you said in terms of looking for those root causes. That's the whole systemic nature of what it is that we're dealing with. It is hard sometimes to find it. Increasingly, it seems like the more that I look, the more that I see, and it seems like the more that we get at, the more that we discover in terms of unpacking some of these laws that undergird these systems of oppression and exploitation. And so we'll be definitely, we just put our agenda into Ledge Council last week, but I'll circle around with you personally in talk offline with you on some of the policy that we're going to be moving. Some of it does speak to economic empowerment and wealth and land and housing ownership and mental wellness as well, cultural empowerment and COVID relief. But there's a lot that y'all just put out. Miss Jess Hyman and Rachel Batterson, thank you so much. You guys are amazing. And hopefully I can catch up with y'all later. and get some more information on you, because we will be putting together campaigns around the policy, which means, of course, there'll be outreach and training and education and webinars and all of the other stuff that goes along with that. So hopefully we can lean on some of you with some of your expertise. I know, Rachel, I've heard a lot about you. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Board, for putting this on. I really appreciate it. It's great work.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention one piece of legislation that may not seem to be related, but I think is, which is the Act 250 overhaul, because as Commissioner Hanford mentioned in the last panel, a lot of times it's Act 250 that's used to oppose development of affordable housing. So one of the proposals, and I'm not as up on this, so you need to check with someone else, but one of the proposals, I think, was to go through a process where a town would go through a designated process, and then they would be exempt from Act 250 in building affordable housing in designated downtown type of thing. Actually, Jen Holler was on here before, and she would know more about that. But that's a piece of legislation that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being related to fair housing and discrimination, but it really is, because of the huge statistical correlation between being poor, needing affordable housing, and being a person of color because of systemic racism. So if you can't build affordable housing in inclusive environments or neighborhoods, you can't end discrimination. And if you currently Act 250, a neighbor can oppose the development because of different reasons, traffic, character of the neighborhood, things like that. So that's a piece of legislation to watch.
If I don't want to take too much of this time, but I just would say that we saw Act 250 with its 50-year review last biennium, and we actually offered testimony, and it's on our list again this year. It's behemoth, and it did cross over. One thing that we were able to get in there is that there would be a racial equity review of the policy by the racial equity executive director. So I don't know whether that's going to stick, but it was kind of a punt on our part, because we thought, let's just throw it over to Susanna, because there's so much in there. Well, not so much like that, but that is definitely on our list this year too. We hope to get some more folks to take a deep dive into that, because there's about 15 different ways that thing can go sideways. And it has been, I can't believe it hasn't been reviewed with a racial equity lens for the last 50 years.
Thank you, Rachel and Mark, for that. I see a question here. How do we also use positive leadership to showcase people and organizations who are setting the standard for fairness? I realize this is hard. I just want to add positive leadership to the mix. Clearly, laws, policies, education, and punitive measures are necessary, but perhaps not sufficient for changing the culture. Jess or Rachel, do you guys want to try to answer that?
I have a thought on that. So I think, the idea of highlighting things that work in communities that work is really important. And so what we see reflected in our media, what our nonprofit organizations like CVOEO put out in our social media, or things that the local newspapers cover, are really important. And so if we can look at communities that are doing this well, that are changing their zoning laws to encourage more affordable housing, denser development, removing exclusionary zoning, if we can highlight that and show that that's what a positive, inclusive, diverse, strong, engaged community looks like, that can help shift the public perception about all of these things. So I think that's one big piece of it. And I was just looking to see if there was another part to Nina's question. Nina, is that helpful?
Yeah. Thank you, Jess.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to also say that while I've mentioned the fact that I'm a BIPOC person and I'm a parent, I'm also a person with a disability, but I really appreciate this question because I'm also a lawyer. And so as an attorney, I often think of solutions which are legal in nature, which is not always the best solutions or not always the only solution. And so oftentimes when people ask me, like, what do you think are the possible changes? What are the things I always go to the law? But that is because of the lens. I also work at an enforcement agency. But there are different ways to really shift culture and change people. And it often starts in communities, and it starts with grassroots organizations. And it isn't always legislators. Sometimes legislators are late to the game. They're the ones responding to what is already changing at the community level. And sometimes legislators can even pass laws that in fact support that kind of effective things that are doing well at the community level. And so we have to be careful about that too. But one of the things that I know to be true is that we can actually change culture through putting money into like public ad campaigns and public health campaigns and being strategic in that way. If you think about the fact that like 20 years ago, everyone thought that smoking was okay. Maybe 20 to 30 years ago, smoking was like the norm in the culture. And then we declared it a public health problem. And then we put money towards it. And then we filed lawsuits against tobacco companies. And then all of a sudden, nobody, like, rarely do you see people smoking, or and those that are still smoking are like, oh, I really want to change this. Everybody has adopted this idea that that's really bad. I don't see why we can't also do that with racism. I certainly think that we can. We just have to do that in addition to changing the laws and putting more BIPOC people in these positions that I talked about earlier. And so that's why it was really exciting to hear that Burlington had declared racism a public health issue, because I think when you make that kind of declaration, usually money can follow that.
There was a question about how do you deal with neighbors who don't want more density in housing, or who try to pass, ordinances to limit density. And the person who asked it doesn't need to be told this, but in general, for people being involved in going to your zoning and planning meetings, I occasionally pop my head up here and there around the state to say, hey, you can't do that. That violates the Fair Housing Act. But I don't know everything that's happening. And I can't do that everywhere. So just go, they're public meetings. You can go and you can say, hey, you can't say we can only have 5-acre lots, because that means you can never build any affordable housing here. And that would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act, probably because of disparate impact on people who are just because of disparate impact, or because of Vermont's law against zoning that excludes people because the housing that might be built there is for lower income people.
I think we're out of time, but I want to, there was a great question here about sort of the conflict between the conflict that exists when people face landlords who are discriminating against them, but they don't have the ability to really bring a claim because they need to maintain that housing. I think we talked about that, and I think that's important. First, I want to say that the law also protects people against retaliation. And so the law exists so that you can't be retaliated against. But what does then happen is landlords retaliate against you through no-cause evictions. So you have to address the no-cause eviction stuff also. And then that way they have to actually give a legitimate, valid reason for evictions. But that's a great question with a complicated and probably longer answer. I want to just ask Rachel and Jess to add any closing comments if you have any.
My mantra for many years now has been build more affordable housing in inclusive neighborhoods and make it open to everybody, not restricted by certain groups.
And I would echo that and encourage everyone to speak up in your community, speak up in your workplace, in your neighborhoods, and call out discrimination when you see it happen. And if you're not comfortable calling it out, call us. That's what we're here for. Call the Human Rights Commission, call legal aid, call the Fair Housing Project, call the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we can help you figure out what to do next.
And while we've talked a lot about the barriers, and we recognize that those barriers are true and they're real, and no one is judged for not bringing a claim forward, I do want to say you bring claims forward to stop discrimination from happening to you. You bring claims forward to stop discrimination from happening to other people. There's good chances that you're not the only person who's been discriminated against. And you bring claims forward because it informs our governor, and it informs the legislature, and it informs our community that discrimination is real, that it is prevalent, it is still happening, and that's how they are motivated and moved to make change. And so those, to me, are really good reasons and valid reasons to bring claims. And so I hope that that's the takeaway. I want to thank everybody for giving us your day today and your afternoon, and just thank you for being here. And then I want to put in a last pitch for tomorrow's, the last day of our Civil Rights Conference, where Dr. Richard Rothstein will walk us through his investigation about housing segregation. And then we'll engage in a really, I hope, robust and yet challenging conversation about what to do with that information. Thank you.